Now that the war in Gaza is at least for now on pause, attention turns to Ukraine. Tomorrow, President Donald Trump meets with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky at the White House. The two leaders are expected to discuss U.S. military aid and whether Washington should take a bigger step by sending long-range Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine. It's a major moment that could reshape America's role in the conflict. To break it down, let's bring in Richard Weitz, director of the Center for Political Military Analysis at the Hudson Institute. Richard, this meeting seems like a pretty big deal. What do you make of it? What do you think Trump and Zelensky are really hoping to get out of this conversation?
The meeting is very important. It does show that President Trump is really interested in what's happening in Ukraine, that he's now shifting partly from the Gaza conflict. The best solution the U.S. can do is just give and pay for air defense weapons for Ukraine itself. But as your package made clear, that won't happen. So the second best solution is for President Trump and Zelensky to push the Europeans to spend more to buy the weapons for air defense and other purposes that the United States has readily available. There certainly is risk, and I'll talk about that in a second, but it looks like President Trump wants to at least make it appear that he's going to give Tomahawks to Ukraine. But their practical impact will be modest because the number that the U.S. can provide Ukraine, the amount of time it'll take, which would be small, the amount of time it will take the Ukrainians to learn how to use them, the prohibitions the U.S. will probably apply against attacking targets near Moscow and so on, won't make them a game changer. They could be useful for pushing the Russian airplanes and missiles farther away from Ukraine. They'll try and stay out of the distance of the Tomahawk. But that missile has a much longer range than anything that's given Ukraine so far. So its use would be tightly controlled by the U.S.
There's been a lot of talk about Tomahawk missiles and even nuclear weapons. In your view, is there any real scenario where Trump would actually let Ukraine use weapons that could hit Moscow?
No, Trump won't let Ukraine have nuclear weapons, and Putin wouldn't let him either. That's the kind of thing that could plausibly invite a massive preemptive strike by Russia if it looked like Ukraine were going to develop or deploy, let alone use nuclear weapons. So I think the idea is, in Trump's mind, he seems to think that he can press the Russian economy. He can continue to leverage his skills as a negotiator. He can work to keep Ukrainian functioning. And at some point, Putin will decide it's just not worth this. I don't know if that's going to work. I think it may take a change in the Ukrainian leadership, but there are clear risks to letting the Ukrainians have these more advanced weapons. So I think Trump will focus more on symbolic support, economic support, and pressure on Putin.
And longer term, do you see Europe being able to pick up more of the slack here, producing its own weapons and helping Ukraine directly?
In a couple of years, no. Longer term, possibly. But most people think it could take 5 years, and it's just more difficult for the Europeans. So the U.S., it's one large country. Of course, the states and the companies fight over the contracts, but once they're issued, it's the companies will go around and get the best subcontracts they can. In Europe, it's a bigger fight because you have these different countries competing. They won't support a program where the benefits will go to another country unless they're compensated. They fight over whether it should be an American system or a German system or a French system. So it's going to take the Europeans much longer to get up to speed than the Ukrainians need. And they're never going to be as effective as if the Europeans would just buy the weapons from the US and give them to Ukraine.
Thank you, Richard. Let's bring in another voice now. Alexander Tsvalina, a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. Alexander, when you look at this upcoming meeting, what stands out to you? Do you see it as a turning point in how Trump approaches Ukraine?
So, as you have mentioned prior, Trump and Zelensky are scheduled to meet at the White House this upcoming Friday, with the discussion expected to focus on weapons supply to Ukraine, specifically the big question on whether the United States will provide long-range Tomahawk missiles. My personal take on this is that it is significant because it shows a continued change in tone from the White House in Ukraine. This follows an increasing pro-Ukraine rhetoric from President Donald Trump, following his September 23 comment that he said NATO countries should shoot down Russian aircraft if they enter their airspace, and the same day on September 23rd with US President Donald Trump's post that Ukraine, with the support of the European Union, is in a position to fight and win all of Ukraine back. Also in that post mentioning that Russia is a quote-unquote paper tiger. This is a stunning about-face from President Trump that continues considering the halt of aid and intelligence following the tense Oval Office meeting earlier this year that resulted in a brief halt in intelligence and weapons sharing from the United States. This continuing trend of increased negotiation, of increased dialogue with Ukrainian President Zelensky, and the increasing supply and discussion of weapons supply to Ukraine is a continuation of this positive trend.
Ukraine's been buying a lot of weapons through NATO programs lately. Do you think that's helping Kyiv stand on its own feet or making it more dependent on the West?
The primary purchasing of the weapons for Ukraine right now comes through the NATO purchasing program that Trump announced earlier this year. This is the recent funding scheme, which is funded by European allies in Canada, consists of regular packages of weapons that are purchased by European allies to purchase United States weapons to provide to Ukraine. This is the prioritized Ukraine requirements list, which allows Ukraine to purchase stockpiles of U.S. weapons with cash provided by European partners. This is, for example, earlier yesterday, U.S. Permanent Representative to NATO, Matthew Whitaker, in announcing the major announcement regarding arms supply to Ukraine, he said this is the time for NATO allies to step up and really operationalize their commitment to Ukraine and to the defense of Ukraine. To get back to your original question, this represents a continued support of both NATO and the European allies of Ukraine, both on the military and diplomatic front, and provides a solid front against further Russian aggression in Europe and in Ukraine.
Before we go further, let's quickly explain something that keeps coming up in this discussion, the Prioritized Ukraine Requirements List, or PURL. It's basically a way for Ukraine to get the weapons it needs quickly. European countries and Canada provide the cash, and Ukraine uses that money to buy US-made weapons directly from stockpiles. So it's kind of like a shopping list. Ukraine tells its partners what it needs most, and NATO helps make sure it gets delivered. With that in mind, Alexander, how do you see this program affecting Ukraine's independence and its relationship with the US and Europe?
I cannot speak to the regulations with the UN, but I can say that NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte warned that Russia is ready to use could be ready to use military force against NATO within 5 years, and that NATO members need to increase their air and missile defenses by, I believe the number he provided was 400%. This is part of an ongoing effort to enhance missile defense system on the eastern flank, following recent Russian incursions that were similarly brought up during the UN General Assembly of both Russian drones and fighter planes on of NATO territory in both Estonia and in Poland. This follows an increase in open rhetoric and willingness from NATO member countries to reinforce their eastern flank, as evidenced by Polish Foreign Minister Radosław Sikorski's call to shoot down Russian missiles and even planes that entered NATO airspace. These were all issues that were brought up at the UN General Assembly, with Russia either deflecting these issues or saying that they were, quote unquote, an accident. But common Western intelligence shows that this is not an accident, and this is a continuous probing of NATO air defenses, and also diplomatically, a continuous probing from Moscow to see how far they can get into NATO airspace through this hybrid threat from drones, from fighter planes, but also sabotage and espionage in Poland and in other eastern flank countries.
That's our look at the upcoming Trump-Zelensky meeting and what it could mean for Ukraine's defense and U.S. involvement. We'll be keeping an eye on any updates from the White House and from Kyiv as the story develops. I'm Kat Pokras. Thanks for joining us.